Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to today's session on mobile security in the enterprise. We cover three basic topics here today. First, talking about kind of which route to take, whether you're going to go the corporate owned asset path or allow personally owned devices. We've touched on this topic and others in the past. Going to go a little bit more in depth, kind of do a little bit of a comparison, give you some ideas of things to think about before we get into some of the advanced strategies for securing the mobile devices, especially on the corporate side, versus how are you going to address the challenges of BYOD or bring your own device if you allow the personally owned devices. So start at the basics. We can either provide corporate owned equipment, which is the leasing or purchasing of all your own tablets, laptops, peripherals, etc., and then give those to the staff at no charge to them, but then they're expected to carry, maintain, use, etc., or allow people to use their own devices, which introduces a whole nother set of problems, but offsets cost from the perspective of you're not out buying a bunch of stuff to start with. So pretty easy concept. But when we start to dive down into it, let's talk a little bit about pros and cons. I tried to keep it limited to probably what I would consider the most important pros and cons for each. There's obviously more than what's on the screen. From a corporate owned perspective, it's highly manageable. When you own the asset, it's no different than a workstation, a laptop, a server, etc. So there's a lot that you can do if you spend the time, money, and energy to configure and lock down the device. It also allows you to use a single stack or a single type of product. So for example, if you're using an antivirus product on your workstations and servers, you can extend that potentially to the phones or the tablets. If you have a set of software, VPN, other things like that, they're all going to be potentially capable to be used on those devices, which hopefully means you don't have to go out and buy additional software or hardware to support these devices. You just have to expand your license count. There's always little caveats there that maybe something that works on a workstation doesn't necessarily work on a phone, or it works on Android but not Apple, those kinds of things. So there are nuances, but for the most part, it's nice if you can keep that stack. You can satisfy a lot of administrative and technical controls. So not only can you put policy in place that says, here's how I expect you to behave, you can put a technical control in there that limits a lot of those behaviors so that you're not relying on an honor system. That's going to work out well when it's time to go get audited and pass any type of audit certification. Now, there are some downsides, obviously. It's the most costly option because you are going to have to go out and invest in additional infrastructure. You're going to have to replenish this and refurbish this over a certain amount of time. Um, as your company grows, you're going to have to buy more of it. If your company shrinks or people leave, you may have to take some of this back. You may not have a use for it, but you've purchased it. So a lot of costs go into this route. But again, that's what allows it to be so manageable and to have the pros that we talked about. There's typically longer deployment times. And what I mean by that is um, because you're going to manage it at a higher level and you're going to put a lot more software on it or restrictions on it, it's going to take longer to get devices ready versus if I just have someone using their own phone and I want them to get to email, I just allow them to install Outlook on their own phone and there they go. So from a deployment perspective, it's more about getting the devices prepped, very similar to if you were going to go out and image a workstation and then mail it to someone versus the person's using their home PC. So exact same concept. And then it requires employees to manage multiple devices. So some employees are not going to like the idea that I have to carry two phones, a personal phone and a work phone, just to be able to answer a phone call or check my email. So we saw that a lot back in the BlackBerry days. At one point, people just started using the BlackBerry as their personal device to help cut down on it. But then when they went to leave a company or had a problem giving that device back, everything that was stored on it became an issue. So that will bring in all sorts of user experience issues at the expense of being more manageable and more secure. On the personally owned side, it's obviously the least costly route because you don't have to do anything. They already own it. Now, I did put an asterisk next to least costly and most costly. And the reason for that is in a lot of companies, you'll see things like reimbursing people for phone usage. So they get to use their personal phone, but every month you pay their phone bill. So when I say least costly, it's really from a upfront capital perspective. It doesn't mean that it's going to cost you nothing by going this route. I've already discussed shorter deployment times and longer deployment times. The shorter really again comes from the fact that the user's device is pretty much good to go out of the box. It may not be secure in any manner, but it's ready to be used. And the users only have to manage one device typically, so that's something that most users like. There are exceptions where one person uses a tablet for corporate work because they want a larger screen, and then they use a phone just for phone calls. So they might be carrying two devices, but that's personal preference. So you're not typically going to hear an employee complain because they've chosen that. On the con side, it's far less manageable. There are a lot of softwares and vendor products that can go on these devices that can allow you to manage them in a similar manner as a corporate-owned device, but it's going to take in to a lot of issues of privacy and user experience and whether they like the idea of you having that type of access to their personal, privately owned device and data. It's likely not going to be a single defined tech stack. One, because it's going to be harder for you to push your tools out when you don't have full control over them. And then asking each user to use the same antivirus or the same whatever product that we're using is going to be difficult. You may be able to streamline and say, we're going to use the corporate VPN, so everyone uses that, everyone uses Outlook, fine. But those are more like business apps and have nothing really to do from the security perspective and what you're expecting your end user to have to protect those devices and the data that they'll ultimately store on it. And then normally this only addresses administrative controls. You're giving them a set of policies and procedures to follow, most likely on an honor system. You'll get credit for that. But then when you go through an audit, they're going to say, but how do you ensure that X is occurring? How did you stop Y from occurring? And in most cases, you're not going to have that same flexibility and the ability just to provide evidence of that. So a lot to think about there. If the higher security is on your list of things that need to get taken care of, the more you're going to lean to corporate owned assets. In my experience, the more user experience and cost come into play. Personally owned seems to be the way that the companies start, and a lot of companies remain. Look at some advanced strategies though for securing corporate mobile devices. So as I stated, there's a lot of things that you can do. Some of the upfront ways from a software perspective is you can remote wipe the device. Now, depending on what device it is, what operating system it runs, what software you use, what licensing you have, you might be able to just simply wipe the whole device, and that's the extent of what you can do, which again is not good on a personal device, but it's fine on a corporate device. Or you might be able to go and wipe individual types of data. Like I want to remove all Office, SharePoint, Teams type data, but I don't want to affect Adobe or something else that you've allowed the user to put on there, like taking photos, for example. You can enable the use of biometrics, so fingerprint scans, retina scans, those types of things. You can put stronger encryption on it. It might slow the device down. It might require a beefier device. You might be able to buy a more advanced device with trusted architecture and equipment built in. But there's a lot of options there of things that you can place on it because you've purchased the equipment and you've secured it in advance of giving it to the employee. You can do a lot of things around geofencing and geoblocking, where that device can be used, how it reports in, the logging that comes from it to your SIM. There are obviously ways around this. We'll talk about those a little bit in a few minutes here. But for the average user who's not trying to purposely and intentionally circumvent security, you're going to have these features that could be built in. Now, again, you may have to go and buy other products to enable this functionality, but it is an option when using the corporate mobile device. Also, location finding. So if the device gets lost, you want to know if the person's going out of the country, whatever the case may be, you'll have those options as well. So a lot of good reasons to actually go over to the corporate device. In addition, there's a lot of software solutions and network segmentation and policies that you can put in place. You can install advanced antivirus platforms that you may or may not have on the personal devices. You can mandate a use of corporate VPN or any VPN. So you, as an example, could have it to where every time the phone turns on, it automatically connects to a VPN that you've selected to give you some form of guaranteed security. Now, there are, again, double-edged swords to a lot of this stuff. VPNs, depending on how you have things configured, could allow the user to use the phone outside of the US or the device outside of the US. And if your policy is that's not authorized, VPN is a way to get around that in some cases. You can limit the data usage, how things are used with GPOs, where data goes, what type of data flows. So there's a lot that you can do there. A lot of advanced tools, though, that come into play there. And a lot of times, in most cases, it's going to be an extra purchase of software or definitely a license upgrade. A lot of zero trust options and how you design this network, how you design these devices, their connectivity. Are you enabling a workflow but not giving people access to the actual network, not placing them on the network? And then again, I touched on this earlier, but log aggregation into the SIM is a big one. If you control that device and you buy the right software and the right products, you can configure it in a way that you can collect all of these logs, and your SOC can then be analyzing it from a security incident perspective, as well as you may have dashboarding and reporting capabilities from a business usage perspective. When we talk about BYOD, this one is far more challenging to kind of corral and get into shape in the way that you'll feel good about your risk profile. Again, it all circles around the fact that these devices are not under your control. There may be apps and data that's under your control, but you don't control the whole thing. So you're not going to control the make, model, and version of the device. You're not going to control what operating system they're using, what level of updates they're up to. Do they even keep their device updated? You're going to have to deal with the fact that corporate data is likely going to be co-located with personal employee data. And by personal employee data, I mean the employee's actual data that they've put on that device. One of the challenges here is when you download a file, for example, on a mobile phone, it usually goes into a downloads folder, or documents all go to a documents folder, photos all go to a photos folder. So once it's all downloaded like that, you now have this co-located data, which is very difficult to find and delete without potentially deleting someone else's. Even in the case of backups, you want to protect the data and you want to back up your corporate data. You might be backing up their personal data. So a lot of issues around the data side. The same security controls cannot be put in place because it's going to restrict personal usage. So let's say, for example, you don't want anyone to be able to work from outside of the US, or you want someone to have a VPN on at all times. That may restrict their personal usage, and they're not going to want to do that. And you're most likely not going to have the ability to mandate it from a technical control perspective. You're only going to tell them administratively, this is the expectations that we have. And again, once you get to that kind of level of strictness and security, you're going to have users pushing back saying, this is my device, I don't want it to be used for that. Which leads to the next point. Many employees are just going to come up and say, I don't want the company to have access to my device, and refuse to use it. So one of the issues here with this bullet is that an employee has every right to say, I don't want to use my personal device for work, and I don't want to use it and have you reimburse me. This is mine. I have the right to this. Give me a corporate device if you want me to do it. The company obviously doesn't have to go out and spend the money and give the corporate device, but then you're going to get into this kind of conundrum where you say, I expect you to be accessible and be able to work at any time, potentially, if I need you. How do I do that when you can't work from your phone because you won't adhere to our security standards and I won't give you that phone? It could get down as basic as a phone call. If you're calling a corporate phone, the expectation is the person holding the corporate phone answers it. If you're calling their personal phone and it's after hours, do they have to answer it? Legally, I have no idea what the response is, but from a corporate perspective, we expect certain things of people in different roles within the organization, and we don't always marry up the technology and the policies to match it. So before you go down this path of choosing one or the other, that's something I would sit down with, and I would also invite, have you guys invite some form of general counsel to get involved and start talking about privacy laws, what can be enforced. Does something have to be in your job description? Does it have to be part of an agreement that's signed? Does it have to be part of your employee handbook? I don't know the legality aspects of it, but it's something I think is worth looking into before you put it out there. Otherwise, at the end of the day, all you have is, this is our expectation, and whether people follow it or not, it becomes irrelevant. And then last but not least, on the BYOD devices, there are many applications and behaviors that are going to directly or indirectly impose risk to the company. So, as an example, there's a lot going on right now with TikTok. So, if TikTok is used on your device and the data is accessible by, I believe it's Oracle, I'm not 100% sure, and then it's that data and the algorithms are accessible by Communist Party of China, as an example, is that a device that you would want your corporate data sitting on at the same time? And how would you know if that personal device is running software like that? And I use TikTok as an example, but there are 1,000 different social media platforms and messaging apps and things of that nature that could be in a very similar boat. But use one like that as an example to just ask yourself, would I feel comfortable with this? Again, you go the corporate route, you can absolutely mandate that software is not installed, and therefore there's more protection. So I think as you go through and look at both of these options, you're going to see that from a security, manageability, peace of mind, audit certification perspective, hands down, corporate assets are the way to go. The question really becomes then, is the cost and the level of effort worth it? And what type of data do you have? What type of work do you do? What type of regulations do you have? Are you highly regulated or not? All of those things are going to come into your decision, but it should be fairly cut and dry what the two options are, what their pros and cons are, which ones you can do more or less with, and then it's just meeting the need of your organization. I do recommend that this should not be an IT decision only or a security decision only. Really should get a lot of stakeholders from different departments in there just to talk about the user experience, just to talk about what's important to the business, and clearly identify what is the need of the business. When we start talking about data and things like that, we say company data is important. But if we haven't categorized our data, if we haven't classified our data, if we haven't marked our data, then even if you do roll out one of these programs, how confident can you feel that you can identify that data and protect it? So there's a lot of prerequisites, I think, that go into this as well. You should not make this decision in a vacuum is my main point here. So please engage with as many people as possible. And on that note, that is it for today. I hope it was beneficial, and I will see you guys in a month. Thanks.